Hello, and welcome back to the Legends of War podcast. I'm your host, Griffin, and today we'll be talking about the 1915 Gallipoli Campaign. Gallipoli and its ill-fated campaign still resonate over 100 years after the event. This brief campaign, fought between April 1915 and January 1916, was doomed from the beginning. It's been criticized as a hopeless attempt guaranteed to do nothing but preside over an epic slaughter of its combatants. The Battle of Gallipoli was an Ottoman victory, a resounding victory that hemmed the Allies into three fragments of the peninsula, leaving them unable to break out. Because of the Ottoman forces' determined soldiery, competent leadership, and intelligent use of terrain and resources on their home territory, the Allies had little choice but to retreat from the peninsula. Constantinople was never under threat. Following this failure by the Allies, Gallipoli became a battleground of a new sort of war of words between nations seeking to blame others for what was ultimately a failure. Accusations began before the campaign was over, and reputations were destroyed. Churchill fell from grace and would serve his own time on the Western Front as a battalion commander of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. General Ian Hamilton, commander-in-chief of the military forces and one of Britain's most senior and experienced soldiers, would never again serve in a meaningful military capacity. Like Vimy Ridge for the Canadians, Gallipoli has become associated with the birth of a nationhood. New Zealand and Australia emerged from behind the skirts of their mother country, and a new nation of Turkey rose from the burning ashes of the Ottoman Empire. Gallipoli is a place of great national pride for the Turks. Their campaign was a well-executed defense of their homeland, leading to an increased memorialization of the peninsula. Every year, thousands of people from Australia and New Zealand crowd to the small cove, officially named Anzac by Mustafa Kemal, the former military commander and founding father of the Republic of Turkey. The limited facilities have created tensions as crowds of people have caused the erosion of the fragile surfaces, leading to a controversial new roadway that cuts through the fragile battlefield terrain and exposes the bleached white bones of soldiers' remains. The 1915 Gallipoli campaign was short. It took just over 8 months and was extremely bloody. Casualties were high, as were deaths caused by illnesses because of disease and poor hygiene. The logistically challenging and poorly planned Gallipoli was a perfect example of how not to execute an amphibious landing. But without the painful and bloody lessons learned at Gallipoli, the enormity of planning the Normandy invasion of 1944 would have been even more difficult. Many published books trace the well-worn path of discussing the Gallipoli campaign, considering the what-ifs and drawing conclusions based on the stated ambitions. There have been accounts from both parties, though relatively little accessible work from the Ottoman side, analyzing the minutiae of the campaign from its mapping to its medical preparations, original research, and even insights into many new angles. This short read is intended as an overview of some of the most critical aspects of the campaign. It's meant to be a basic introduction to the battle for a new audience. Since the end of the Crimean War, the Balkans have been in a near constant state of turmoil. This instability was because of the dangerous state of its two oldest empires, the Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire. Ripped apart by ethnic differences and new national awareness, the Balkans turned inwards on each other in 1912. Creating a powder keg that would ultimately lead to the First World War. After the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, the major European powers were now at each other's throats. And to quote Sir Edward Grey, the lamps are going out all over Europe. For the Ottoman Empire, the prospect of another war was unpalatable. The Young Turks, who had overthrown the Sultan in 1909, had modernized the country and the military, but still it wasn't enough. The Ottomans were defeated in the Balkan Wars, and their European possessions were stripped, to only a small part of Thrace and a sliver of land that would form the northern shore of the Dardanelles Strait. The Dardanelles is a narrow passageway between Asian Turkey and Europe. It's a tightly constrained waterway created by geological faulting over hundreds of years. This waterway connects the strategic Aegean Sea in the Mediterranean with the Sea of Marmara through to the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea, point of interest for military strategists for centuries. Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, guards the entrance to the Black Sea and controls entry into the winter Russian ports. Because of this and several other reasons, Constantinople had been coveted for hundreds of years, especially by their old enemies, Russia and Greece. The Gallipoli Peninsula guards the Dardanelles shores on the European side of Turkey. It's a narrow finger of land named after its first settlement, Gelibolu or Gallipoli. On the Asiatic shore, opposing this, is the greater part of modern Turkey and the heart of the faltering Ottoman Empire in 1915. While fortified for centuries, the idea of squeezing ships between the tight shores of the Dardanelles had fascinated the military minds of many nations for hundreds of years. When Germany declared war on August 4th, 1914, the Ottoman Empire was neutral. The Ottomans had signed a treaty with Germany, binding them into the Central Powers. The Kaiser believed in a greater Germany with an influence that could spread throughout the Balkans and into the Middle East. It was a dream that would manifest itself into constructing an unbroken railway link from Baghdad to Berlin, through Thracian Turkey and into Anatolia, passing over at Constantinople. This rail link would pass through Allied nations, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, but the belligerent Serbs sat squarely in the way. Germany was going to make sure its eastward enemy, Russia, was depleted in support and supplies. As most Russian war material would have to travel the southern winter route through the straits into the Black Sea, the temptation to make sure the Dardanelles were closed to traffic was significant. German influence was already strong, from military missions into the Ottoman Empire since the late 19th century. Their influence would become even more pronounced when the British Admiralty, headed by Churchill, fearing the lean toward Germany, confiscated 2 large battleships being built by the British shipyards intended for the Ottoman Empire. This brought tensions to a boil on August 10th, when German warships Goeben and Breslau were granted passage through the supposedly neutral Dardanelles to Constantinople. These ships became symbolic substitutes for the ships stolen by the British. The final and fatal blow to British influence was the appointment of German Admiral Wilhelm Souchon to command the Ottoman Navy. With the Ottomans committed to war, the British sought to ensure they would be dispatched quickly. The British and French believed that this would remove any possibility of Ottoman aggression against their possessions and protectorates in the Middle East. The Allied powers had low opinions of the strength of the Ottoman military, especially considering their defeat during the Balkan Wars. For hundreds of years, Russia and Greece had yearned to possess the imperial city of Constantinople, which sat in ultimate control of the Black Sea route. While the Ottomans, in such a weak position, the gears of diplomacy began to grind. The essential goal was to carve up what remained of the Ottoman Empire, spreading from European Thrace into the Arabian Peninsula. First to act were the Greeks. On August 19th, the British received a notice that the Greek navy and military resources were now at the Allies' disposal. Seizing this, the Russians approached the pro-German Greek king Constantine, married to the Kaiser's sister, and asked him to provide an expeditionary force to attack the Dardanelles. All eyes were now focused on Constantinople. This combination of circumstances led to the evolution of the Dardanelles expedition gradually spiraling out of control, and would consume all involved and have lasting effects on their lives. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the conflict left the Allied powers with little choice but to show their intentions that this would not be taken lightly. The Russians showed by military force that the Ottoman decision to side with the Central Powers in the upcoming conflict was unwise. The British exercised the old concept, famous in the 19th century, of forcing the Dardanelles to threaten Constantinople, especially if the Greeks could take the north shore of the Strait of the Gallipoli Peninsula in force, and the Russians could be there to assist the Allies at Constantinople. In their minds, this would undoubtedly lead to an Ottoman surrender and remove any threat to Egypt and the Suez Canal. At the first meeting of the War Council in November 1914, Churchill reignited the Dardanelles question by suggesting the best way to protect the Suez Canal in Egypt was to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula. He persuaded the Council that this would be possible only with naval action. This set the scene for the Gallipoli landings. On January 3, 1915, Admiral Sir Sackville Hamilton Carden, the commander of the Eastern Mediterranean Squadron, was asked for his views on the idea of forcing the Dardanelles. Churchill, at the time, was First Sea Lord and had high hopes that the age-old naval concept of putting ships' guns against stone fortresses and forcing a passage through the Dardanelles Straits could be achieved. However, he did not know that the Dardanelles were as well defended as they were. Admiral Carden was cagey with his political masters. He replied that the Dardanelles should not be rushed. He suggested that by using extended operations with large amounts of ships, they might be forced, but he was cautious. However, the British Admiralty took this statement as a positive and requested Admiral Carden to expand on his ideas. The Admiral detailed a four-stage plan that involved reducing the forts at Sedelbahir and Kumkal at the mouth of the Dardanelles, then destroy the inside defenses of the entrance of the Narrows, reducing the forts at the Narrows, then finally clear the minefield, which would reduce the defenses above the Narrows and then advance into the Sea of Marmara. While this plan was cautious and careful, it caught Churchill's imagination, and he believed he could execute it in theater by just seeing the plan written. Admiral Carden's plan would ignite the flames. The Admiralty decided that a combined operation was preferable to an only naval attempt, and it would be necessary for troops to follow up to secure success. The Gallipoli Peninsula and Constantinople would need to be occupied. With the Russians and Greeks involved, there could be no doubt about the success, but there were no guarantees that any initial diplomatic advances would have any concrete proposals. Field Marshal and Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, believed that no British troops were available other than those already committed. Lord Kitchener was an autocrat, careful in the way of husbanding his military resources and resistant to many schemes that would widen the war on other fronts. He did not believe in diverting valuable manpower from the only front that fully engaged the Germans in Flanders. Kitchener believed the Western Front would need to come first and that attacking Gallipoli would be a costly, bloody, and lengthy campaign. But the Admiralty believed that attempting a purely naval attempt in the Dardanelles would not be enough. Churchill stated at a war council that the Admiralty should prepare for a naval expedition in February and assault the Gallipoli Peninsula by bombardment with Constantinople as its objective. He also hinted at the military objectives. In addition to ships, a special service force of 2 Royal Marine Light Infantry battalions would be reserved for Dardanelles service. They were sent to the island of Lemnos in February 1915 and used as demolition parties against batteries and forts. This set the scene for a greater military engagement and, ultimately, the landings at Gallipoli. The momentum was now gathering.
Before the Gallipoli Campaign was formed, the British had planned to carry out an amphibious assault near Alexandretta in the Mediterranean in 1914. This idea was presented to Kitchener in order to split the capital from Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Alexandretta was a strategic center of the Ottoman railway network. Victory here would carve the Ottoman Empire in two. East Indies Commander-in-Chief Vice Admiral Richard Pierce ordered Captain Frank Larkin of the HMS Dorius to Alexandretta on December 13, 1914. The French cruiser Requin and the Russian cruiser Askold were both there. Kitchener had devised a plan in March 1915 to incite an Arab revolt. The landing at Alexandretta was eventually abandoned because it would have needed more resources than France could give. Also, France did not want the British to function in their sphere of influence. On the Western Front, by late 1914, the British and French counteroffensive at the Marne's first battle had finished. The British, French, and Belgians suffered enormous losses in the pre-battle in Flanders. The initial war of maneuver had ended, and now trench warfare had begun. Austria-Hungary and the German Empire closed the overland trade routes between France, Britain, and Russia to the east. The White Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk were ice-covered in winter and distant from the Eastern Front. The Imperial German Navy had blockaded the Baltic Sea, and the Ottoman Empire controlled the entrance to the Black Sea through the Dardanelles. While the Ottomans remained neutral at the time, supplies could be sent to Russia through the Dardanelles Strait, but before the Ottomans entered the war, the strait had been closed. In November, the Ottomans mined the waterway. The French Minister of Justice proposed attacking the Ottoman Empire in November, but this was rejected. An effort by the British to buy off the Ottomans also failed. Later that month, Churchill suggested a naval attack on the Dardanelles based partly on erroneous reports of Ottoman troop strength. Churchill wanted to use several obsolete battleships in the Gallipoli Campaign with a limited force the army would provide. He believed an attack on the Ottomans could bring Bulgaria and Greece, formerly Ottoman possessions, into the war for the Allies. In January 1915, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II appealed to Britain for help against the Ottomans who were campaigning in the Caucasus. In February 1915, a British seaplane from the HMS Ark Royal flew a sortie over the Dardanelles Straits. 2 days later, the first attack began when an Allied task force, which included the British HMS Queen Elizabeth, started a long-range bombardment of the Ottoman coastal artillery batteries. The British planned to use 8 aircraft from the Ark Royal to spot for the bombardment, but harsh weather rendered all but one of these unserviceable. The weather had slowed the initial assault, but by February 25th, the outer forts had been destroyed and the entrance cleared of all mines. The Royal Marines were then landed to destroy the guns at Saddlebahir and Kumkal, where the naval bombardment shifted to the batteries between Kepez and Kumkal. Churchill was frustrated by the ability of the Ottoman defenders that evaded Allied bombings and still threatened minesweepers sent to clear the strait. Pressure mounted on Naval Commander Admiral Carden to increase the fleet's effort. Carden drew up new plans on March 4th and cabled Churchill, informing him the fleet would arrive in Constantinople in less than 2 weeks. The sense of approaching victory was increased by the intercept of a German wireless message that revealed Ottoman forces were running low on supplies and ammunition. Some Dardanelles forts were entirely out of ammunition. When Carden received this message, he agreed that the thrust of the attack should be landed around March 17th. Before the assault, Carden suffered a stroke from stress and was placed on the sick list. Admiral John de Robec took over his command. On the morning of March 18, 1915, an Allied fleet of 18 battleships, destroyers, and cruisers attacked the narrowest point of the Dardanelles, where the strait was 1 mile wide. Despite light damage from the Ottoman fort's return fire, the minesweepers were ordered along the strait. According to the official Ottoman account, by 1400 all telephone wires were slashed, all communications with the forts were interrupted, and some guns had been knocked out. Because of the artillery fire, the defense slackened significantly. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine and capsized in less than 2 minutes. Only 75 sailors survived out of a crew of 718. Minesweepers manned by civilians retreated under Ottoman fire and left the minefields mostly intact. The HMS Inflexible and HMS Irresistible also struck mines, and the former was sunk with most of her remaining crew rescued. The HMS Inflexible was severely damaged and forced to withdraw. During the battle, there was confusion about the damage's cause. Some accounts blame the torpedoes. The HMS Ocean was sent to rescue the HMS Irresistible, but was damaged by an artillery shell before striking a mine and sunk. French battleships Gaulois and Suffren sailed through the line of mines placed stealthily by the Ottoman mine layer Nusret 10 days earlier and suffered significant damage. These losses forced Admiral de Robec to withdraw and protect what remained of his force. Some naval losses had been expected during this campaign, and mainly out-of-date battleships inadequate to confront the German fleet had been sent. However, a handful of senior naval officers, like Commodore Roger Keyes, commander of the Queen Elizabeth, felt they had come close to victory. They believed the Ottoman guns had nearly ran out of ammunition, but Admiral de Rebec's views prevailed. The Allied attempts to force the strait using naval power were ended because of losses attributed to poor weather. The next step was to capture the Turkish defenses by land to open up the way for the ships. After the failed naval attacks, troops assembled to eliminate the Ottoman mobile artillery, preventing Allied minesweepers from clearing the way for larger vessels. Kitchener appointed General Ian Hamilton to lead the 78,000 men of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. Soldiers from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force and Australian Imperial Force were camped in Egypt, training to join the fight. The Australian and New Zealand soldiers were molded into the famous Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC. They were commanded by General William Birdwood and comprised the Volunteer 1st Australian Division and the New Zealand Division. The 29th Division and the Royal Naval Division also joined these ANZAC troops. The French Orient Expeditionary Corps, which initially comprised 2 brigades with 1 division, was also placed under General Hamilton's command. Over the following month, Hamilton developed his plan for the British and French divisions and joined the Australians in Egypt. Hamilton planned to focus on the southern part of the peninsula at Seddul-Bahir and Cape Helles, where an unopposed landing was expected. At first, the Allies discounted the fighting proficiency of the Ottoman soldiers. This naivety of Allied planners was illustrated by a leaflet issued to the British and Australians still in Egypt. Quote, "Turkish soldiers, as a rule, will surrender by holding the rifle butt upward and waving clothes or rags of any color. If an actual white flag is used, it should be regarded with suspicion, as the Turkish soldier is unlikely to have anything of that color." End quote. Underestimating the Ottoman military stemmed from an Allied sense of superiority because of the decay of the Ottoman Empire and its inferior performance in Libya during the War of 1911 and the Balkan Wars of 1912. This led to the Allied intelligence failure to adequately train for the campaign and sometimes even relying on information gained from Egyptian travel guides. The troops loaded on transports in the order they would disembark, causing a long delay. This cost many troops, including the French at Mudros, to detour into Alexandria before finding a ship that would take them into battle. This caused a 5-week delay until the end of April, during which the Ottomans strengthened their defenses on the peninsula. Poor weather in March and April might have delayed landings anyway, which would have prevented supply and reinforcement. After preparations in Egypt, Hamilton's headquarters staff arrived at Mudros on April 10th. The Anzac Corps left Egypt in early April. They assembled on the island of Lemnos in Greece on April 12th, where a smaller garrison had been established in early March, and training for the amphibious landings was started. The 29th British Division left for Mudros on April 7th, and the Royal Naval Division trained on Skyros Island after arriving on April 17th. That same day, the British submarine HMS E-15 tried to run the strait, but struck a submarine net and ran aground. The submarine was shelled mercilessly by the Ottomans, killing its commander and 6 of her crew. The survivors were forced to surrender. On March 19th, British and French troops in the Allied fleet assembled at Mudros to try again. Poor weather prevented them from making the landing and grounded Allied aircraft for 9 days, restricting them to a limited schedule of reconnaissance flights. The Ottomans were prepared to repel landings on either side of the strait with their Fifth Army. This force comprised 5 divisions with another on the way. It was a conscription force commanded by Otto Lyman von Sanders. Many senior officers in the Ottoman Fifth Army were German. Ottoman commanders and senior German officers discussed the best method of defending the peninsula. They agreed that the best defense was to maintain the high ground on the ridges of the peninsula. While there was a disagreement about where the enemy would land and where to centralize forces, Colonel Mustafa Kemal was knowledgeable about the Gallipoli Peninsula from his operations in the Balkan Wars. He predicted that Gaba Tepe and Cape Helles, the southern tip of the peninsula, were the likely areas for an Allied landing. Mustafa Kemal believed the British would use their naval power to control the land from every side of the peninsula's tip. This meant from Gaba Tepe it was only a short distance to the eastern coast where the Allies could reach the Narrows, the right-angled bend in the middle of the Dardanelles. Ottoman commanders believed Besika Bay on the Asiatic coast was most vulnerable to an invasion. The terrain was easier to cross, and the Allies could attack the Ottoman batteries guarding the straits, where a third of the Fifth Army was assembled. Two divisions concentrated at the north end of the Gallipoli Peninsula at Bulair, protecting the communication and supply lines to the defenses further down the peninsula. The 9th and 19th Divisions were placed along the Aegean coast and on the tip of the peninsula at Cape Helles. The bulk of the Ottoman forces were inland in reserve, leaving a bare minimum of troops guarding the coast. A cavalry brigade with the 3rd Division arrived from Constantinople in early April, bringing Ottoman frontline strength to over 60,000 men. Sanders concentrated these troops into 3 groups. A maximum effort was ordered to improve land and sea communications and move reinforcements swiftly into threat points. Troops moved at night to bypass Allied air reconnaissance. Sanders' strategy was opposed by the other Ottoman commanders, including Mustafa Kemal, who believed that the defenders were too widely spread out to defeat the invasion on the beaches. Kemal believed that Sanders' strategy was suitable when there was a strategical deepness to the front, but Gallipoli did not offer that. Sanders was confident that a rigid system of defense would fail, and the only hope of success was in the movability of his troops, mainly the 19th Division near Bogali held in reserve and ready to move to Gabatepe, Bulair, or the Asiatic shore. However, the time needed by the British to organize the landings meant the Ottoman defenders had more time to prepare their defenses. The British allowed the Ottomans an additional 4 weeks to plan and prepare before the assault. Roads were built, small boats were made to take troops and supplies across the Narrows. Beaches were wired, and makeshift mines were built from torpedo warheads. Gun placements and trenches were dug along the beaches, and troops ran marches to avoid being lethargic. The 19th Division under Mustafa Kemal was vital to the beach's defenses, and he observed and awaited signs of an invasion from his post near Maidos. The Ottomans also created aviation squadrons with German help and had 4 operating aircraft around Kankale. The Ottomans conducted reconnaissance sorties from April 11th onward. Their aircraft made frequent flights over Mudros, monitoring the assembly of the British naval force from an airfield they established near Gallipoli. In April 1915, the Allies intended to land and secure the northern shore of Gallipoli. They planned to capture the Ottoman forts and artillery batteries so a fleet could sail through to the Narrows and the Sea of Marmara toward Constantinople. Initially scheduled for April 23rd, but postponed until the 25th because of bad weather, the landings were planned to take place at the 5 beaches on the peninsula. The 29th would land at the tip of the peninsula at Helles, then advance on the forts at Kilabahir. The 3rd Australian Infantry Brigade, the Anzacs spearheading the assault, would land north of Gabatepe on the Aegean coast, where they would cut off the Ottoman troops in Kilabahir by advancing across the peninsula and stopping reinforcements from reaching Cape Helles. This sector of the Gallipoli Peninsula would be known as Anzac Cove. The area held by the French and British became known as the Helles. The French had made a diversionary landing on the Asian shore at Kumkal before re-embarking to secure the eastern area of the Helles sector. Naval gunfire support for the landings had initially included bombarding the beaches and approaches. In reality, it was changed to engaging the ridges around the landings, with only the beaches to be shelled before the landings. No decision was made about the issue of close support, and instead left to the discretion of the ship's captains. A hesitancy to approach the shore later affected the landings at beaches V and W. This was where some of the worst losses among the infantry occurred. Naval gunfire supported landing troops at beaches S, X, and Anzac Cove. But even then, the effectiveness could have been improved by the initial onshore confusion, broken terrain, thick vegetation, and lack of observation. Kitchener had ruled that the Royal Naval Air Service must meet air requirements, and the Allies employed a small force of seaplanes and other aircraft from the RNAS, which arrived at the end of March. The squadron was unchallenged at first by the small Ottoman Air Force. The Allies' small force of aircraft had been used to provide aerial surveillance, although it eventually proved incompetent to meet the intelligence the Allies needed to make up for the lack of adequate maps. After the landings, Allied aircraft carried out photographic surveillance, observed naval gunfire, reported on Ottoman troop movements, and conducted several bombing raids. General Birdwood's Anzac troops numbered over 25,000 men at the northern landing. This force would be the first on the beach and cut the communications to the Ottoman forces in the south. The 3rd Infantry Brigade would be the covering force and advance inland to establish positions on Gun Ridge. The 2nd Infantry Brigade would follow and capture higher ground on Sarre-Blair. The 1st Infantry Brigade would be the last to land and act as the division's reserve. The main Anzac force would assemble at night and execute a dawn landing, surprising the defenders on the evening of April 24th. The covering force embarked on destroyers and battleships with follow-on forces and transports. Troops would disembark from the transports in ships' boats. Then they'd be hauled close to shore by steamboats before rowing ashore. At 0200, an Ottoman observer reported multiple ships on the horizon. A captain in charge of the company from the 27th Infantry Regiment confirmed the sighting with his binoculars and informed his commanding officer at Kaba Tepe. By 0300, the moon was covered and the ships weren't detectable. The Ottomans weren't sure if this was an actual landing or diversion. Once powerful artillery was heard at around 0600, 2 battalions of the 27th Infantry Regiment were urgently ordered to make their way to Ari Banu. Lyman von Sanders had left his headquarters and was at Boulaire with the Ottoman 5th Division, waiting for the actual landing. His absence created problems in the chain of command and delays in decision-making, which negated his defense scheme that relied on rapid troop movement. At 0400, on the morning of April 25th, the first wave of troops from the 3rd Brigade began moving towards the shore on ships' boats. The covering force landed approximately 2 kilometers too far north and ended up in a bay south of Ari Banu. Because of undetected currents or navigational error, the landing was on ground that rose steeply from the beaches, unlike the southern aim, which was more open. Only 2 Ottoman companies garrisoned the landing site. However, they held the high ground and inflicted considerable casualties on the Australians before being overtaken. The jagged terrain hampered a coordinated drive inland. The Australians were on unfamiliar ground and used inaccurate maps. In the maze of dense scrub, spurs, and steep ravines, Australian parties that lost contact were reorganized into smaller groups. While some Australian troops reached the second ridge, only a few reached their objectives. The rest had become scattered. The covering force provided little support for the follow-up force. On April 25th, the 1st and 2nd Brigades, followed by the New Zealand and Australian divisions, landed on the beaches around Ari Banu. But they got entangled, and it took over 4 hours after the landing began to sort them out. By then, the bulk of the 1st Australian Division was ashore safely. Its leading elements were pushing inland by mid-morning. Kemal had reorganized the defenders for a counterattack on the commanding heights of Sarre-Blair. The right flank of a small beachhead taken by the Australians was repelled at 10:30, with most of 400 Plateau being lost. During the afternoon, the left flank was forced back from Baby 700. By evening, Birdwood believed, after information from the Navy, that embarkation was impossible and ordered the troops to dig in. The Ottoman counterattack eventually was repulsed, and the Australians established a perimeter roughly from the northern Walker's Ridge to Shell Green in the south. Anzac casualties on the first day numbered over 2,000 men. Failure to take the high ground caused a tactical stalemate, and the defenders contained the landings in a perimeter less than 2 kilometers. The Australian submarine HMS AE2 penetrated the strait on the night of April 24th. As the landings began at Cape Helles and Anzac Cove at dawn on April 25th, the submarine reached Shanak at 0600, torpedoed a Turkish gunboat, and then evaded a destroyer. The Australian submarine then ran aground beneath the Ottoman fort, but the gunners failed to turn their guns quickly enough, and the AE2 submarine maneuvered safely away. Shortly after she floated away, her periscope was sighted by an Ottoman battleship firing over the Allied landing sites. The AE2 advanced towards the Sea of Marmara at 0830 and waited on the seabed until nightfall. At 2100, the AE2 surfaced to recharge batteries and send a wireless report to the fleet. The message detailed how the landing at Cape Helles was proceeding well, but Anzac Cove was unsuccessful, and Birdwood contemplated the re-embarkation of his troops. The success of this Australian submarine was a consideration for Birdwood's decision to persist. Reports of the sub's exploits improved the soldiers' morale. The AE2 was given orders to generally run amok. With no enemies in sight, she sailed into the Sea of Marmara, where she operated for 5 days, attacking Ottoman ships. The 29th Division landed on 5 beaches around the tip of the Cape Helles Peninsula. They were known as S, V, W, X, and Y beaches, laid out strategically from east to west. On May 1st, the 29th Indian Brigade landed and took Sari Blair above the landing beaches. The 5th and the 10th Gurkha Rifles and the Zion Mule Corps joined them. At Y Beach, during the first engagement of the Battle of Carinthia, the Allies landed unopposed and advanced inland. There were few Ottoman defenders in the village, but without orders to advance their position, the commander at Y Beach withdrew his force back to the beachhead. This was the closest the Allies would come to capturing the village. The Ottomans quickly brought up a battalion of the 25th Regiment to stop any further advance. V Beach was where the main landing was made, under the fortress of the old Seto Beher. Landings were also made at W Beach, on the other side of the headland to the west. A covering force of Royal Munster Fusiliers was landed from a converted coal transport ship, the SS River Clyde, which ran aground beneath the fortress so the soldiers could debark along ramps. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers disembarked at V Beach, while the Lancashire Fusiliers landed at W Beach using open boats onto a shore obstructed with barbed wire and overlooked by dunes. On both beaches, Ottoman troops held strong defensive positions and caused several casualties to Allied landing troops. Machine gunners shot soldiers emerging one by one from the ports on the River Clyde at Seto Beher Fort. Out of the first 200 men to land, only 21 reached the beach. The Ottoman defenders didn't have enough manpower to overwhelm the landing, but they inflicted considerable casualties and contained the attack close to shore. By the morning of April 25th, the Ottomans were out of ammunition and had only bayonets to meet the Allies' troops. They fought fearlessly on the slopes that led up from the beach to the ridge of Chinook Bear. The 57th Infantry Regiment received orders from Mustafa Kemal, ordering them to fight and die, giving other troops and commanders time to come forward to take their places. Every man of that regiment was wounded or killed. At W Beach, known afterward as Lancashire Landing, the Lancashires overwhelmed the Ottoman defenders despite taking 600 casualties out of 1,000 men. The Lancashires earned 6 Victoria Crosses at W Beach, with another 6 awarded to troops at the V Beach landing. Another 3 were awarded over the following days as they fought inland. 5 squads of Ottoman infantry distinguished themselves by repelling several attacks from their hilltop position. The Ottomans eventually disengaged under the cover of darkness. After the landing, so few men remained from the Munster and Dublin Fusiliers that they were merged into the Dubsters. Only one Dublin Fusilier officer survived the landing. Out of the 1,012 Dubliners who landed, only 11 survived the Gallipoli Campaign unscathed. After the landings, there was little done by the Allies to advance their position, apart from a few small thrusts inland by groups of men. The Allied attack lost momentum, allowing the Ottomans time to bring up reinforcements and rally the small number of defending troops. 6 battalions of the 5th Division reinforced the 19th Division to strengthen the Ottoman counterattack at Anzac on the afternoon of April 27. With naval gunfire support, the Allies held back the Ottomans during the night. The next day, French troops transferred to the right of the line near S Beach and joined the fight. On April 28th, the Allied forces fought the First Battle of Krithia and captured the village. The Ottomans halted the Allied advance halfway between Krithia and the Helles headland around 1800, causing over 3,000 casualties. With the arrival of Ottoman reinforcements, the potential of a quick Allied victory on the peninsula evaporated, and the fighting at Anzac and Helles became a battle of attrition. On April 30th, the Royal Naval Division landed, believing the Allies were on the verge of defeat, and moved 8 troops forward through a gully near Lone Pine and 400 Plateau. 8 battalions of reinforcements were sent from Constantinople a day later. On that afternoon, Ottoman troops counterattacked at Anzac and Helles. The Ottomans momentarily broke through to the French sector, but the attacks were repelled by Allied machine gun fire, which inflicted severe casualties on the Ottoman attackers. General Birdwood ordered the New Zealand and Australian divisions to attack. The Australian 4th Infantry Brigade and the New Zealand Infantry Brigade, along with the Royal Marines, took part in the attack. They were covered by an artillery and naval barrage. While the troops advanced a short distance through the night, they became separated in the dark. The attackers came under fierce small arms fire from their vulnerable left flank and were repelled, suffering over 1,000 casualties. On April 30th, the submarine AE-2 rose uncontrollably, surfaced near an Ottoman torpedo boat, dropped below the safe diving depth, and broke the surface again on the stern. An Ottoman torpedo boat fired on AE-2 and punctured her pressure hull. The crew was ordered to abandon ship. The sub was scuttled, and the crew taken prisoner. The AE-2's achievement showed it was plausible to force the straits, and soon British and French operations badly disrupted Ottoman communications. On April 27th, HMS E-14 entered the Sea of Marmara on a 3-week patrol. It became one of the campaign's most successful Allied naval actions, sinking 4 ships, including the transport Gul Jamal, carrying 6,000 troops into the fight for the Ottomans at Gallipoli. The amount and value of the ships sunk was minor, but the results on Ottoman communications and morale were significant. After the success of E-14 and AE-2, a French sub named Jules tried the passage on May 1st, but hit a mine and went down with all hands. On May 5th, the Allies dispatched the 42nd Division from Egypt. Believing Anzac Cove to be secure, Hamilton brought the Australian 2nd Infantry Brigade and the New Zealand Infantry Brigade, along with 20 field guns, to the Helles front as reserves for the upcoming Second Battle of Krithia. The Allies were using a force of 20,000 men, and the first general attack on Helles was planned for daylight. French troops were ordered to capture Karivisdare, while the British, New Zealand, and Australians were assigned Achi Baba and Krithia. After 30 minutes of artillery bombardment, the assault began mid-morning on May 6th. The French and British advanced along Fir Tree, Krithia, Gully, and Krivis Spurs, separated by deep gullies and fortified by the Ottomans. As the attackers advanced, they got separated while trying to outflank the Ottomans, finding themselves in unfamiliar terrain. Under artillery and machine gun fire from the Ottoman outposts, they had not been spotted by British aerial surveillance, and the attack was stopped. 4 battalions of New Zealanders attacked up Krithia Spur on May 7th. The 29th Division reached a position south of the village before dusk. The Australian 2nd Brigade quickly advanced over open ground to the British front line. Through fierce small arms and artillery fire, the brigade charged toward Krithia and gained 600 meters, just 400 meters short of the objective, while suffering over 1,000 casualties. The New Zealanders could link up with the Australians, but the British were held up and the French were exhausted, despite occupying a point overlooking their objective. The attack was suspended after failing to take Achi Baba or Krithia, and this forced the Allies to dig in. By now, the Allies were nearly out of ammunition, especially since the artillery on both sides merged their defenses. The Ottomans relieved troops opposing the Australian line, reinforced by the Australian light horse operating now as infantry. Erratic fighting persisted with sniping, grenade attacks, and raids. The opposing trenches were separated only by a few meters. The Australians lost several officers to sniping, including the commander of the 1st Division, Major General William Bridges, who was wounded while inspecting a light horse regiment position. He died from his injuries on the hospital ship HMHS Gascon. At the end of April, General Birdwood told GHQ, General Headquarters, that he couldn't land 6,000 horses at Anzac Cove because there was no water for them. GHQ was disappointed that the Anzac force would be immobile on the beachhead. Even so, they would have been of no use. Thousands of men and their horses stayed on board the ships for over a month. Birdwood signaled that the transports would return to Alexandria and offload over 3,000 men and 5,000 horses. Headquarters insisted that some men remain in Alexandria to look after the horses and guard the Anzac's many vehicles and mountains of baggage. On May 19th, 42,000 Ottoman troops launched an attack at Anzac Cove to smash the 17,000 New Zealanders and Australians back into the sea. While short on ammunition and artillery, the Ottomans planned on surprise and strength in numbers. On May 18th, the crew of a British aircraft spotted the Ottoman soldiers and relayed the information to Allied planners. When the Ottomans attacked, the Allies were waiting. The Ottomans' assault was a failure at a cost of over 13,000 casualties, with over 3,000 men killed. The butcher's bill for the Australian and New Zealanders was 160 killed and 480 wounded. Of the dead was a stretcher bearer named John Simpson Kirkpatrick, whose efforts to evacuate wounded men on a donkey while under fire became famous among the Australians. After the war, his story became a legend in the Australian narrative of the campaign. The Ottoman losses were so severe that a truce was organized to bury the dead laying in no man's land. This led to some camaraderie between the armies, like the Christmas truce on the Western Front in 1914. According to an eyewitness account from Private Laidlaw of the Australian 2nd Field Ambulance, the armistice was declared at 8:30 a.m. This morning around 4:30 p.m., it was wonderful. Things were so unnaturally quiet I felt like getting up and making a row myself. The rifle fire was quiet. There was no shell fire. The stench from the trenches where the dead had been laying for weeks was something awful. Some bodies were mere skeletons. It seemed so very different to see each side near each other's trenches burying their dead. Each man that took part in the ceremony was called a pioneer, and he wore 2 white bands on their arms. Everyone also took advantage of the armistice to do anything they wanted out of covering. A large number of men are down bathing. You'd think today was Cup Day down at one of our seaside beaches. The British advantage in naval artillery dwindled after the battleship HMS Goliath was torpedoed on May 13th by an Ottoman destroyer. German submarine U-21 sank the HMS Triumph on May 25th and HMS Majestic on May 27th. More British surveillance patrols were flown around Gallipoli, forcing the U-21 to leave the area. The Allies shifted several ships into Imbros where they were protected between sorties, significantly reducing Allied naval firepower, particularly in the Hell sector. The sub HMS E-11 passed through the Dardanelles on May 18th. It sank or disabled 11 ships, including 3 on May 23rd, before entering Constantinople harbor. The E-11 also fired on a transport near the arsenal and sank a gunboat, damaging the pier. The Ottoman forces were short of artillery, ammunition, and field batteries. They could only fire 18,000 shells between May and the first week of June. After the defeat of the Ottoman counterattack at Anzac Cove in mid-May, Ottoman forces ceased all frontal assaults. Toward the end of the month, the Ottomans began tunneling in the Anzac sector early on May 29th, despite Australian countermining detonating a mine and attacking with troops from the 14th Regiment. The Australian 15th Battalion was repelled but counterattacked, recapturing the ground before being relieved by New Zealand troops. Anzac operations in early June returned to minor engagements and skirmishing with grenades and sniper fire. In the Helle sector, both sides were entrenched. On June 4th, the Allies attacked Achibaba and Krithia with the 29th Royal Naval Division, the 42nd Division, and 2 French divisions. This attack was repelled, and with it, the possibility of any decisive breakthrough ended. Trench warfare resumed, with the objectives calculated in tens of yards. Casualties were appalling on both sides. The French lost 2,000 men out of 10,000. Out of 20,000 troops, the British lost 4,500. The Ottoman losses were over 9,000 casualties. In June, the carrier HMS Ben Mishri arrived, increasing the Allied air effort. The 52nd Division landed at Helles to prepare for the Battle of Gully Ravine, beginning on June 28th and successfully advancing the British line along the left flank of the battlefield. On June 30th, French commander Henry Gouraud was injured and replaced by his divisional commander. In the first week of July, the Ottomans counterattacked the new Allied line multiple times, but failed to regain the lost ground. Ottoman casualties mounted and were estimated at 14,000 men. On July 2nd, 2 brigades from the 52nd Division attacked the center of the line along Bloody Valley, Achibaba Nula, and gained very little ground, taking 2,500 casualties out of 7,500 men. The Royal Naval Division suffered 600 casualties, and French losses were over 800 men. Ottoman losses were around 9,000 casualties and 600 prisoners. At sea, the submarine E-14 was active in the Sea of Marmara. On July 21st, the E-14 forced her way through the strait despite a new anti-submarine net near the Narrows. On July 27th, the E-14 got caught in the net, forced to surface, and shelled by shore batteries. She was scuttled, but before that she torpedoed the battleships Barbarossa Hayreddin, causing the loss of 253 men and sinking a gunboat, 7 transports, and 23 sailing vessels. The Allied failure to capture Krithia and the Hellas front stalemate led Hamilton to create a new plan. The general intended to secure the range of hills and capture the high ground on Hill 971 in the battles of Saribert and Chunukbair. By now, both sides had been reinforced. The original 5 Allied divisions were increased to 15, and the first 6 Ottoman divisions were now at 16. The Allies were going to land 2 fresh infantry divisions from 9 Corps at Suvla, just 8 miles north of Anzac. These troops would be used in an offensive against the Saribert range by advancing through thinly defended terrain north of the perimeter around Anzac. The Allies could attack Baby 700 by dismounting Australian light horsemen. This would coincide with an attack on Chunukbair by troops from the New Zealand Infantry Brigade, who would traverse Rhododendron Ridge. The 29th Indian Brigade Gurkhas would attack Hill 971 along with the Australian 4th Infantry Brigade. The Allies had 40 aircraft against the Ottomans' 20 planes, of which 8 were stationed at Kankale. Allied aircraft spotted for naval guns, made reconnaissance flights, and carried out the low-level bombings of Ottoman reserve forces as they were brought up onto the battlefield. Allied aircraft also undertook shipping operations in the Gulf of Saros, where they sank an Ottoman tug with an air-launched torpedo. On August 6th, the Suvla Bay landings took place against light opposition. The British commander, General Frederick Stopford, limited his early objectives and failed to push his advance far enough inland and seized little more than the beachhead. The Ottomans occupied the Anfarta Hills and prevented the British from penetrating inland, effectively containing the landings and reducing the front at Suvla to destructively static trench warfare. The Allies' offensive proceeded on the same evening of August 6th by diversionary attacks on Hellas, with the Battle of Krithia Vineyard becoming another costly stalemate. The 1st Australian Infantry Brigade led the Battle of Lone Pine and captured the main Ottoman trench line. It diverted Ottoman forces, but the attacks at Hill 971 and Chunukbair were miserable failures. The New Zealanders came within 500 meters of the Chunukbair summit on August 7th. Still, they could only seize the summit the following morning. On the morning of August 7th, the Australian 3rd Light Horse Brigade attacked a narrow front coinciding with the New Zealand attack against the rear of the Ottoman defenses. The opening artillery barrage was lifted 7 minutes too soon, and the Australian 4th Infantry Brigade, along with an India Gurkha Brigade, got lost during the night. The attack on Hill 971 never happened. The Ottoman defenders repelled Allied attempts to renew their attack at a significant cost to the Allied forces. The New Zealanders could hold out the attack at Chunukbair for 2 days before being reinforced, but an Ottoman counterattack on August 10th, led by Mustafa Kemal, swept through them from the heights. 711 men from the New Zealand Wellington Battalion who reached the summit were casualties out of 760. After the Ottomans recaptured the ground, the possibility of an Allied victory was lost. Just before the evacuation at Anzac Cove, troops from the new Australian 2nd Division arrived from Egypt with the 5th Infantry Brigade in tow. The 29th Division was moved from Hellas to Suvla. The British made another attempt to resurrect their offensive on August 21st in the battles of Scimitar Hill and Hill 60. If they had taken control of the hills, they would have united the Anzac Cove and Suvla fronts, but their attacks failed. On August 17th, Hamilton requested another 100,000 troops, but a day earlier, the French announced their plans for an autumn offensive in France to Kitchener. This led to a meeting of the Dardenelles Commission on August 20th, which determined that a French offensive would be supported by a maximum Allied effort, leaving only about 25,000 reinforcements available for the Dardanelles. On August 23rd, after news of the failed attack on Scimitar Hill, Hamilton went on the defensive as Bulgaria entered the war. This allowed the Germans to rearm the Turkish army and leaving little opportunity for resuming any offensive operations. On September 20th, the Newfoundland Regiment was deployed along the 29th Division. On September 25th, Kitchener proposed attaching 2 British and 1 French division for service in Greece at Salonika. This spelled the beginning of the end of the Allies' campaign in Gallipoli. Hamilton withdrew the 10th Irish Division and the 156th Infantry Division, and by the end of September, these troops were mustering at Mudros for deployment to the new French front. During this impasse, an old Ottoman batman, personal servant assigned to officers, could hang his platoon's laundry on the barbed wire undisturbed. Also, gifts were now being exchanged across no man's land. sweets and dates from the Ottomans, and packs of cigarettes and cans of beef from the Allies, conditions at Gallipoli grew worse for everyone. The intense summer heat and pitiful sanitation caused an explosion in the fly population. It became difficult to eat, as unburied corpses were putrid and bloated. Allied troops were in a perilous position because they were poorly situated, and this caused shelter and supply problems. A dysentery epidemic spread like wildfire through the Anzac trenches at Helles and caused a terrible suffering and disease, along with numerous deaths on both sides. After the disappointment of the August offensive, the Gallipoli Campaign began to crumble. The Ottoman successes affected public opinion in Britain, and reporters like Keith Murdoch and Ellis Bartlett smuggled out criticism of Hamilton's performance. Other officers contributed to the air of doom and gloom and raised the possibility of evacuation on October 11, 1915. Hamilton opposed the idea. He feared the damage it could cause to British prestige, but was replaced shortly afterward by General Charles Monro. The Ottoman winter eased the brutal heat, but led to flooding, gales, and blizzards. This resulted in thousands of men suffering from frostbite and death from drowning and freezing. The defeat of the Serbians in the autumn of 1915 prompted Britain and France to transfer troops from the Gallipoli Campaign into the Greek Macedonia. This would open up a Macedonian front, helping what was left of the Serbian army to conquer Macedonia. On September 4th, submarine HMS E7 got caught in an Ottoman anti-submarine net as it began another tour. Despite these reverses, by mid-September, Allied mines and nets had closed off the eastern entrance of the Dardanelles to German U-boats. The U-21 was thwarted when it tried to pass through the strait on September 13th. The first French sub to enter the Sea of Marmara was called the Turquoise and was forced to turn back on October 30th. When the French sub returned to the Dardanelles Strait, she ran aground beneath an Ottoman fort and was captured intact. Her crew of 25 was taken prisoner along with documents detailing planned Allied operations, including a scheduled rendezvous on November 6th. This rendezvous was kept by the German U-14, which torpedoed and sank the HMS E-20, killing most of her crew. The Gallipoli situation was only made worse when Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. By October 1915, the French and British opened a second Mediterranean front at Salonika by moving 2 divisions out of Gallipoli and reducing the flow of reinforcements. This opened a land route between the Ottoman Empire and Germany through Bulgaria. The Germans could now rearm the Ottomans with heavy artillery to devastate the Allies' trenches, especially on the Anzac front. At the end of November, an Ottoman crew in a German Albatros C-1 modern aircraft shot down a French plane over Gaba Tepe. More Central Powers artillery units arrived, substantially reinforcing the Ottoman artillery. General Monro recommended evacuation of Kitchener, who visited the eastern Mediterranean in early November. After consulting with the commanders at Helles, Suvla, and Anzac, Kitchener agreed with Monro and sent his proposals to the British cabinet, confirming the decision to evacuate in early December. Because of the terrain on no man's land and the icy winter weather, casualties were expected during this withdrawal. The pure, untenable nature of Allied positions was made apparent by a rainstorm in late November 1915. The Suvla downpour continued for 3 days before turning into a blizzard in early December. This caused rain to flood trenches, drown soldiers, and it even washed unburied corpses into the lines. Anzac and Suvla were evacuated in late December, with the last troops leaving before the sun came up on December 20th. Troop numbers had slowly been reduced since early December, but the Allied troops left the Ottomans tricky booby traps to contend with. There were self-firing rifles rigged to fire by water that dripped into a pan attached to the trigger. Ruses like this were used to trick the Ottoman troops during the Allied departure. At Anzac Cove, the troops maintained silence for over an hour until curious Ottoman troops ventured in to inspect the trenches, where the Anzacs waited and opened fire. Incidents of this nature discouraged the Ottomans from getting too close to the trenches when the actual evacuation began. The Allied force completed their withdrawal, with the Australians suffering no casualties on the final nights, but large quantities of stores and supplies did fall into Ottoman hands. Helles was kept for a short while, but GHQ's decision to evacuate the garrison was made on December 28th. Unlike evacuating from Anzac, Ottoman forces looked for signs of withdrawal. Using a lull in the action to bring up supplies and reinforcements, Sanders launched an attack on the British at Gully Spur on January 7th with infantry and artillery, but the attack failed. Mines were placed with time fuses, and that night on January 7th, under cover of naval bombardment, the British troops withdrew 5 miles to the beachhead, where makeshift piers were used to board boats. British troops departed from Lancashire, landing around mid-morning on January 8th. The rearguard Newfoundland Regiment withdrew on January 9th. The first to land was the rest of the Plymouth Battalion, while the Royal Marine Light Infantry was the last to leave. Despite predictions of over 30,000 casualties, 35,268 troops with 3,689 horses and mules, 127 guns, 328 vehicles, and 1,600 tons of equipment were removed. Over 500 mules that couldn't be embarked were killed so they did not fall into Ottoman hands, and over 1,500 vehicles were left behind with smashed wheels. As at Anzac Cove, many supplies, including 6 unserviceable French artillery pieces, were destroyed. Ammunition and gun carriages were left behind, and hundreds of horses were butchered to deny them from the Ottomans. A British soldier was killed by debris from a premature magazine explosion. Shortly after dawn, the Ottomans retook Helles. During the last days of the Gallipoli Campaign, a German fighter squadron increased the Ottoman air defenses. This caused the first British flying losses after the Helles evacuation, when 3 German Eindeckers shot down 2 RNAS aircraft. Many will remember the Gallipoli Campaign as a closely fought struggle that ultimately ended in defeat for the Allies. However, others will view the overall result as nothing but a tactical stalemate. Another observation of this campaign is that the Ottoman forces held the Allies back from the actual objective with relative ease. Some could view it as an absolute disaster for the Allies. However, the campaign caused enormous damage to Ottoman national resources. In 1915, the Allies could replenish their troops and supplies better than the Ottomans. But in the end, the Allied effort to secure a passage through the Dardanelles failed miserably. The Allies successfully diverted Ottoman forces away from other Middle East conflict areas. The Gallipoli Campaign consumed valuable resources the Allies could have employed on the Western Front, but this also resulted in heavy losses on the Central Power side. The Allied campaign was plagued by poor planning, insufficient artillery, poorly defined goals, inaccurate maps, poor intelligence, inexperienced troops, inadequate equipment, overconfidence, tactical and logistical deficiencies at all levels, just to name a few. While geography also proved a significant factor, the Allied forces possessed inaccurate intelligence and faulty maps that could not help them use the terrain to their advantage. Ottoman commanders employed the high ground around the Allied landing beaches by positioning capable defenses that stopped the Allied forces' ability to penetrate inland. This confined them to narrow beaches. This campaign's necessity for the war's overall goal remains controversial. The accusations of negligence that followed were so significant, they highlighted the division that had developed between military planners who believed the Allies should focus on the Western Front and those who favored trying to end the war by attacking Germany's soft underbelly, its allies in the East. During the Gallipoli Campaign, French and British submarine operations in the Sea of Marmara were one area of success. The sub-operations forced the Ottomans to abandon the sea as a transportation route from April 1915 to the end of 1915. The British submarines sank 5 gunboats, 11 troop transports, 1 destroyer, 1 battleship, 148 sailing vessels, and 44 supply ships at the cost of only 8 Allied subs sank in the strait in the Marmara Sea. In October of 1915, 9 Allied subs were active in the Mediterranean following the evacuation of Helles. The Ottoman Navy was forced to stop all area operations while merchant shipping was also significantly curtailed. If the communication sea lines had been severed, the Ottoman Fifth Army would have faced a catastrophe. These operations were a source of grave concern. They posed a constant threat to shipping and caused heavy losses, effectively stopping Ottoman troops intending to reinforce their forces at Gallipoli and shelling railways and troop concentrations. Gallipoli also marked the end of General Hamilton's career. The competence of Australian brigade commanders Henry Cheval and John Monash were recognized, and they were promoted to corps command positions. Kitchener's influence also dwindled after the May 1915 coalition government was formed. A growing sense of failure in the Gallipoli campaign culminated in Kitchener being overruled on advising for French support in Salonika in December 1915. The fight for Gallipoli emboldened the Ottomans' belief that they could defeat the Allied forces. In Mesopotamia, the Turks encircled a British force at Kut al-Amara, causing them to surrender in April 1916. Ottoman forces in southern Palestine were confident about launching an attack against Egypt in the Suez Canal. Their defeat at the Battle of Romani and the lack of supplies to complete the military railway necessary for such an upward operation marked the end of that ambition. The optimism gained by the Ottomans from the triumph at Gallipoli was swapped for a sense of despair as the British kept on the Middle East offensive for the rest of the war. Gallipoli's amphibious operations were studied by military planners and influenced other amphibious campaigns like Normandy in 1944 and the Falklands in 1982. Gallipoli's lessons learned influenced the U.S. Marine Corps' amphibious operations doctrine during the Pacific War and World War II. The Gallipoli Campaign became a well-studied subject as it related to amphibious warfare in the United States and Britain. Gallipoli had all four types of amphibious operations: demonstration, raid, assault, and withdrawal. Analyzing the Gallipoli Campaign before the outbreak of World War II, it was believed that amphibious assaults would fail against modern defenses. Even despite the landings in Tarawa, Italy, and the Gilbert Island chain, this perception continued until June 1944 at Normandy. The invasion of Normandy proved opposed landings were possible with proper planning. Gallipoli's memory weighed upon the Australians during the planning of the 1943 Huon Peninsula Campaign. In September, Australians made the first opposed amphibious landing since Gallipoli at the Finschhafen Battle in New Guinea. Navigational errors caused troops to land ashore on the wrong beaches, but they were still trained according to Gallipoli's lessons and quickly reorganized, pushing inland. The political repercussions in Britain had begun during the battle. The uproar following Conservatives learning that Churchill would stay forced Prime Minister Herbert Asquith to end his Liberal government and form a coalition government with the Conservative Party. The Asquith government responded to the failure and fury over Gallipoli by setting up an inquiry commission. A Dardenelles commission was set up to investigate the expedition's failure. The first report was issued in 1917 and published in 1919, following the failure of the Gallipoli campaign. General Hamilton was recalled to London in October, ending his military career. Churchill resigned in November 1915 and took command of an infantry battalion on the Western Front. Asquith was partially blamed for Gallipoli. He was ousted in December 1916 when David Lloyd George proposed a war council under his authority. The Conservatives and the coalition threatened to resign unless this plan was implemented. After failing to reach an agreement, Asquith resigned and David Lloyd George became Prime Minister. Lloyd George formed a new government. In the summer of 1917, Churchill was appointed to the cabinet as the Minister of Munitions, not to the War Cabinet. The Commission's eventual report was published in 1919. It concluded that Hamilton was over-optimistic from the beginning and that he had added to the difficulties. Hamilton emerged from the investigation more favorably than perhaps was justified, partly because he tried to conspire with witnesses and was able to get leaked reports from the Commission's deliberations. Hamilton was never given another appointment. Casualty figures for the Gallipoli campaign vary between sources. According to a study published in 2001, over 100,000 men were killed, with 56,000 Ottoman and 53,000 British and French soldiers. Using the Turkish archives, it's estimated that the Ottoman casualties in the Gallipoli campaign were 56,000 men dead, 97,000 troops wounded, and 11,000 missing or captured. British General John Maxwell said, "The appetite, the Dardanelles for men has been wicked and phenomenal." There were over 500,000 casualties during the Gallipoli campaign. The British history of the Great War lists the casualties as over 205,000 British, 47,000 French, and 251,000 Ottoman troops. Modern-day Turkish sources refer to these casualties much higher, at Ottoman casualties at 350,000. According to the New Zealand semi-official history, there were about 16,500 New Zealanders that had served at Gallipoli, with about 251,000 Ottoman battle casualties, including 86,000 dead. Over 2,800 New Zealanders were killed, and about a quarter of those who disembarked on Gallipoli were wounded. Other estimates show an even higher amount of New Zealand soldiers serving at Gallipoli, with over 16,000 and nearly 9,000 dead. The unsanitary conditions led to many soldiers becoming sick from typhoid, dysentery, and diarrhea. It was reported that over 90,000 British soldiers were evacuated for sickness during the campaign. Over 150,000 British troops fell sick, not counting Indian or colonial troops. Of these, 3,800 died. The sick were conveyed from Gallipoli to hospitals in Malta and Egypt as quickly as possible because the bases in the area of operations were insufficient. The proportion of disease casualties to battle casualties was much higher in the Gallipoli campaign than in the campaign on the Western Front. Approximately 3% of the men removed as non-battle casualties died against less than 1% in Flanders and France. Estimates of the Ottoman troops evacuated were at over 65,000. The most significant cause of non-battle admissions to the hospital for Allied troops was dysentery at 30,000 men. Add another 11,000 for diarrhea, and frostbite caused over 6,600 hospitalizations. Gonorrhea made up another 1,800 cases, and pneumatic fever was 6,500 cases. French casualties during this campaign amounted to around 47,000 of the French casualties. 27,000 were killed, wounded, or missing, with another 20,000 of having fallen sick. There were allegations that Allied forces had bombed Ottoman hospitals and hospital ships during the start of the campaign and in September 1915. By July 1915, there were over 20 Ottoman hospitals with 10,000 beds, including 3 hospital ships in the area. The French government disputed these accusations through the Red Cross. The British replied that if these bombings had happened, it was purely accidental. Russian officials alleged that the Ottomans had attacked 2 of their ships, but the Ottomans answered the vessels had been the victim of mines. No chemical weapons were used at Gallipoli. However, the Allies debated the use throughout the campaign and transported to the theater large amounts of gas used against the Ottoman troops in the Middle Eastern theater 2 years later during the multiple Gaza battles in 1917. The Allied troops were withdrawn to Lemnos and then to Egypt. French forces were combined into the Army of the Orient and then employed at Salonika. In Egypt, the British and colonial troops from the Dardanelles, along with new divisions from the United Kingdom and Salonika, were merged into the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force and commanded by General Archibald Murray. They joined the Egyptian forces to become the British Empire's Strategic Reserve, comprising 13 mounted divisions and infantry, which totaled over 400,000 men. In March 1916, General Murray took command of both of these forces and formed them into the new Egyptian Expeditionary Force. He reorganized the units for service in Egypt, Europe, and elsewhere in the Middle East. The Anzac was disbanded. The AIF, Australian Imperial Force, was enlarged with 3 new Australian divisions, and a New Zealand division was formed. These units were moved to the Western Front in the summer of 1916. The importance of the Gallipoli campaign is felt strongly in New Zealand and Australia, despite only being a portion of the Allied forces. The campaign's effect was directly linked to their emergence as independent states. Over 17,000 New Zealanders and 50,000 Australians served at Gallipoli. This campaign proved significant in the emergence of a uniquely Australian identity that followed the war, closely linked to popular conceptions of the soldiers that fought during the campaign. This became embodied in the notion of the Anzac spirit. The April 25th landing is commemorated every year in New Zealand and Australia and is known as Anzac Day. The first event was celebrated unofficially in 1916 in London, Melbourne, and Brisbane, before officially being recognized as a public holiday in the Australian states in 1923. Anzac Day became an official holiday in New Zealand in the 1920s. Organized marches by veterans began in 1925. The same year, dawn service was held on the beach at Gallipoli. The first official dawn service took place 2 years later at the Sydney Cenotaph. During the 1980s, it became popular for New Zealand and Australian tourists to visit Gallipoli and attend the dawn service, and since then, thousands have attended. Along with monuments and memorials built in towns and cities, buildings, streets, and public places were named after elements of the campaign, especially in Australia and New Zealand. Some examples include the Gallipoli Barracks at Enoggera in Queensland, and the Armed Forces Armory in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, now known as the Gallipoli Armory. Gallipoli also significantly affected popular culture, including TV, film, and song. In 1971, a Scottish-born Australian folk singer named Eric Bogle wrote a famous song called And the Band Played Waltzing Matilda, which told the story of a young Australian soldier maimed during the Gallipoli Campaign. This song has been acclaimed for its vivid imagery from the carnage at the Gallipoli landing, and to this day it is far and wide popular, considered by some to be an anti-war song. In modern-day Turkey, the battle is considered a significant event in the founding of a new country. Although primarily remembered for the fighting near Çanakkale, where the Royal Navy was defeated in March 1915, for the Turks, March 18th is like April 25th for the New Zealanders and the Australians, not just a public holiday, but also commemorated with Turks cherishing their martyrs at the Çanakkale victory.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did making it. I'm Griffin from the Legends of War podcast, signing off.